A very good morning or good evening, depending on where you're joining us from, and welcome to a very special virtual edition of Asia Briefing Live 2020. My name is Haidi Stroud-Watts. I'm the anchor of Daybreak Australia and Daybreak Asia on Bloomberg TV, and it's so wonderful to see all of you here joining us today. Before we get underway with today's programs, I'd like to begin by saying that Asia Society acknowledges that many participants in today's event are dialing in from locations that have traditional owners and custodians. I am currently on Gadigal country in the Eora Nation, and I pay my respects to their elders past, present and emerging. I also welcome and acknowledge any Aboriginal, Torres Strait Islander or First Nations people joining our forum today. And I would also really encourage you to watch our full welcome to country that's delivered from Melbourne or Burong country in Kulin Nation. You can find that below, along with, of course, a welcome message from Asia Society and a number of other pre-recorded content that you can watch at your convenience. I'd also like to highlight that today's program is very much an interactive one. You'll be asked to respond to polling questions throughout all of our panel sessions, and I really encourage you to respond to these questions and to ask some of your own questions. Of course, there's always the chat function on your screen as well. You can always please join us on social media through the various social media platforms with the hashtag AsiaBriefingLive. I want to kick it off by asking our polling question, and this is really interesting to me because this has been a question that we've asked in various iterations over the past few years that we've done this program, and it's been really fascinating to see how the responses have really pretty dramatically shifted in tone. So the question is, China's influence, as we know, is rapidly growing in Southeast Asia and the South Pacific through aid, through soft power, hard power, economic investment, military power. What should Australia do? The options are push back and assert our position, or to accept China's rising power and to work with it. So I'm really curious to see what the responses come in at today, because the shift from 2018, when we first asked this question, to this year has been pretty dramatic, with now almost half of respondents saying that we should push back. Back in 2018, 90% actually voted that Australia should just accept China's rising power and to try and work with it. So all of this, of course, brings us to our panel discussion, the first of a very full and fascinating lineup of conversations today. This session, I should note, is presented with the support of our platinum partner, the National Foundation for Australia-China Relations, and for that we're very appreciative. So, with just under 3 weeks until the US presidential election, the stakes have never felt much higher. The implications, the potential for volatility and uncertainty for the global economy, for trade, for security and diplomacy, technology, and of course, being 2020 for healthcare, are all enormous. And all of this, of course, comes against an existing backdrop of the threat of economic decoupling, of deglobalization, of deteriorating supply chains. These themes have already been with us since the last US election. It's now just been exacerbated by the oncoming of the pandemic. So does the outcome of the US election really matter for the course of US-China relations? Or is this relationship one of strategic competition destined to see tension and clashes in the coming decades, regardless of who is in the White House? Who does Beijing want to be in the White House? And perhaps most significantly for our conversations, what's the best course for middle nations like Australia to chart, caught in the middle, while also trying to manage our own pandemic and economic recoveries? Joining me in conversations, and I'm sure with the answers to all of those questions, are our esteemed panelists, and I want to bring them in now. Joining us from Washington, D.C., a very good evening to Maude Glaser, who's a Senior Advisor for Asia Centre for Strategic and International Studies. Thank you for joining us. From Canberra, Richard Maude, Executive Director of Policy at Asia Society Australia. He's also a Senior Fellow at the Asia Society Policy Institute, and it's always great to have you in these conversations, Richard. And finally, from Melbourne, Chengxin, who's the Associate Professor of International Relations at Deakin University. We appreciate your time and your views for us this morning as well. Bonnie, let me start off with you, being in the hotbed of DC as you are, to one of the questions that I sort of raised in my introduction. Does it matter for the future of US-China relations in the next 5, 10, 20 years who is in the White House? Or is the stance that the president has taken of going tough on China really a bipartisan one?
Well, thank you, Heidi. I think it's a very important question. And most Americans, including in Congress and average Americans and thought leaders, and in the Democrat Party as well as Republican Party, agree that China poses the biggest threat to the United States and to our values and to our allies and partners. And in fact, we just did a poll at CSIS in which we asked people in the U.S. public, what's the biggest challenge that the U.S. poses? And 54% found that China views that China is the biggest challenge to the United States. Russia was far behind at 22%. So we agree on the nature, I think, of the challenge that China poses, and in so many domains. I mean, it really is a multidimensional challenge. But I don't think we all agree on what we should do about it. And in my view, China's aggressive foreign policy is in part driven by the perception of the decline of U.S. power and leadership around the world. And this has been, I think, increased and exacerbated under President Trump. The credibility of the United States, I think, is really far lower than it was before President Trump took power. And so if Vice President Biden is elected, I think we will see a more consistent policy, a renewal of interagency mechanisms in the government, which I think will lead to better policy outcomes. We will see greater U.S. commitment to multilateral organizations and definitely more effective coordination with allies. And I think all of this will enable more effective competition with China. And I believe that China's behavior can still be influenced and that there is a need to develop a more consistent set of policies and a more effective set of policies. But we need to make ourselves in the United States more resilient. We need to strengthen our own country in order to be able to compete more effectively. And I think that's what Biden's priority would be.
Richard, I want to pick up on Bonnie's one of her last points, saying that the policy when it comes to China's behavior, I guess, on the global stage can still be influenced. Can Australia play a role in this influence? Because we've seen Chinese state media really portray Canberra as, the running dog of Washington. This is really in part why we've seen the relationship deteriorate so badly. So is there a role for middle nations like Australia to both influence China, but also, I suspect you're going to talk about, influence of policymaking in the US?
Yeah, well, absolutely there's a role for middle powers, and one of the things that we've seen this year, I think, is really an uptick. Middle powers working together, sometimes with the United States, but often just amongst themselves. And if you look at the way in which cooperation between Japan and India and Australia, Vietnam and India, for example, is expanding, there's definitely a sense amongst those countries that they have agency. It's really hard for middle powers to affect the policies and actions of great powers, but the combined weight of those countries in the region is still significant. And if it's not going to be formal alliances, but if those countries more or less want the same kind of region, more or less want the same kind of principles underpinning the region, and are prepared to work more closely together, then that does have some influence. I think that's important. I think that's something that the United States welcomes and encourages, because it can't bear the burden of finding a balance of power in Asia alone, even if it wanted to do it these days. Look, we do have influence in Washington. We can't exercise that by shouting from the sidelines, but it requires very consistent engagement of the administration, whichever party that is at any moment, the Congress, the American business community. It's about patient diplomacy and building of political and economic links. It's about having our own ideas, because it's no good complaining about a particular aspect of US policy and not having an alternative proposition. And then ultimately it's about having a really clear sense of our own national interests and a willingness to go our own way where we think that's important. If you look at the past 4 or 5 years, we've actually done that on quite a few issues where we've had policy differences with the United States. whether that's the Paris Agreement or Iran or the World Trade Organization, World Health Organization, for example. So I think that's the future for Australia and other middle powers.
Chengxin, we've heard repeatedly from President Trump that a Biden-Harris victory would be a gift to Beijing. Do you think Beijing has a preference as to who is in power?
I think there's a widespread perception that China might be preferring Donald Trump because China believes that Donald Trump, the United States, instead of him making the United States great again, it has really prompted the U.S. decline. But I am not a close reader of the Chinese leadership in Beijing, so I assume they would keep their card very close to their chest, not to reveal too much about their preferences.
Chengxin, let me follow up with you then. How different would the Chinese policymaking when it comes to their diplomatic overtures in relation to the US, and I think then in relation to countries like Australia, how different will that be? How much will that shift if there is, if not a softer tone from Washington, but at least a more consistent tone, and one, I think, as Bonnie alluded to earlier, that's maybe based on more traditional, institutional engagement?
I think certainly Beijing will welcome a change of tone towards China because in the last 3 or 4 years, we have seen the really bombastic policy and gesture from the Trump administration towards Beijing, and the trade war, the decoupling talks, and the pressures on various hotspots such as the South China Sea, Hong Kong, Xinjiang, and now Taiwan. So I think in many ways, China, before Trump came to power, Beijing had underestimated Trump's will and power to really to play the hardball. So they have now witnessed this firsthand in the last few years. I think certainly they would welcome a change in the, at least in the style of U.S. China policy, if not the substance.
Bonnie, if there is a change in the administration, are you optimistic that we can put a halt to this perceived decoupling of the Chinese economy from the US economy, I suppose specifically when it comes to this idea of the bifurcation of the world of technology, right? The idea of two internets, the US versus China.
Well, of course, when we talk about economic decoupling, we're not talking about cutoff of trade. We're really talking about the reorganization of a portion of the world's production. And, after China opened up, so many companies moved their operations to China because of lower production costs. That had already begun to change, even before President Trump came to power, with some companies pursuing a China plus one strategy, moving some of their factories to Southeast Asia or maybe even Mexico or India because of just higher costs and growing national security risks. And then policies that China pursued that really privileged their own companies to create national champions. So now this has been compounded, of course, and accelerated by the fact that there is recognition that there's overdependence on China in areas pertaining to national security, where China controls supply chains. And this, of course, pertains to medical goods. It pertains to rare earths. There's also semiconductors, of course, and 5G, which again really predated President Trump. So probably some other areas as well. So the conversation, I think, around decoupling is really it's selective decoupling in areas that affect national security. And my sense is that this will continue in a Biden administration. It may not be quite as extensive, because there is appreciation, I think, in the United States, particularly among the Democrats, that in order to be a leader in innovation, the United States cannot cut itself off from the rest of the world. We shouldn't be keeping smart people out of our country. We need to be issuing visas, encourage immigration, for example. So we don't want to harm ourselves in this process. But I still think that there will be some areas in which we will continue to have differences in maybe even completely separate supply chains, some serving China and authoritarian regimes, and some serving the democratic world. So this is a trend that I think is going to continue.
And Bonnie, I think that kind of goes into the latest CSIS survey of the American public and thought leaders, right? Some of these numbers are pretty astonishing. 54% of the US public thinks that China is the country that poses the greatest challenge to the US, Russia coming in at a very distant second at 22. More than 2/3 of thought leaders support the banning of Huawei and Chinese tech firms from 5G markets. This really is, a pretty popular theme, regardless of which administration we'd be talking about.
Yes, it is. And one of our biggest takeaways is among the thought leaders, and we polled thought leaders in the United States, in Europe, and in Asia, and we found that the vast majority of thought leaders believe that the best way to deal with China is through increased collaboration among like-minded states. So very small percentage of thought leaders want to prioritize cooperation with China. Only 4% of U.S. thought leaders, only 8.8% of the thought leaders in allied and partner countries. And even among the American public, it was only 18.6%. But the number of people who chose the option when we asked, how do you best deal with China, prioritize cooperation with allies and partners, was huge. 80.9% of U.S. thought leaders chose that option. Among U.S. allies and partners, it was 73.6%. So very few wanted to build up the U.S. military unilaterally or prioritize cooperation with China or avoid involvement in security issues involving China. Those were some of the other options. So it's very clear to me that countries that are like-minded with the United States, as well as the American public, think we have to work together in order to develop our own resilience for democracies. We do have to keep Huawei, I think, out of our telecommunication systems. And Australia, of course, was in the lead in that regard. We have to ensure that there's no interference in our politics and societies. But this doesn't mean we can't have cooperation with China, but we have to protect our own values and way of life.
Richard, as Bonnie just mentioned, Australia, of course, has been on a number of sensitive topics, been seen to be pushing back. And I suppose that's also why we've seen the relationship get to the point that it is now with China. At this point, I mean, with the economy being so dependent on how much iron ore China buys, how much other resources and services China consumes, when borders reopen again, we really need international students and tourism from China. Is economic diversification away from that economy even an option?
Look, it's an option up to a point, Heidi, but we do need a dose of realism when we talk about it. And look, as a general rule, of course, we should be working harder to diversify our trade, to open new markets for Australian exporters and companies, and that diversification builds resilience, not just to coercion from China, but to other shocks, not least from pandemics. So diversification is very good in principle. To be fair to successive Australian governments, they've worked quite hard at that. No doubt there is more we can and should do. But I think the dose of realism comes in a couple of points. One is there's no other market in Asia or anywhere in the world that can simply replace China for many of our most important exports, as I think you've already made it clear. Secondly, there remain some quite significant barriers to our trade with other major Asian markets like India and Indonesia, and they've proven quite difficult to remove in the past. I think a third point I would make is that while we have suffered economic coercion from China, and that has cost that has cost the country, the relative cost of that is actually quite small. If you're a barley farmer, of course, it hurts a lot, and that sector has been significantly affected. But if you look at the total damage against the total value of our China, let alone against what our trade with China does for our GDP, then actually it's quite a modest amount. So I don't see any point at the moment in preemptively trying to make ourselves poorer by artificially diverting trade away from China that might not ever come under significant risk. And the last point I would make is that it's sometimes argued that diversification is necessary to reduce China's political leverage over Australia. But if you look at the federal government's policies on China over the past few years, I really don't see much evidence of China having significant leverage, or at least our trade having significant leverage over policy making.
Chengxin, we've got an interesting audience question that's come in, and I think it should be directed at you. Is China economically strong and robust enough to keep using trade as a political weapon, even if it hurts itself?
We all know China is now the second largest economy in the world, and by the purchasing power parity measurement, it's the largest in the world. But also it is not as strong as it seems, because a lot of these China's economy is so intertwined with the global economy. So in a sense, the world needs China, but China also needs the world. So this is this kind of interdependent world in which China has to live with. But by the same token, the rest of the world, to a large extent, has to live with China as well. So I think those kind of economic coercion, it's widely seen as economic coercion, but I think some of those measures are China's response to what it sees as foreign pushback or foreign containment. That might be part of this more or less this playbook of the current economic and political environment. But in the longer term, I think both sides, whoever we talk about, would realize that the world would need more cooperation, especially in the post-COVID period.
Chengxin, so in that case, how do you think Beijing perceives initiatives like the Quad leaders that met very recently in Asia when Mike Pompeo was in the region? Do they see that as a threat, as a coordinated regional attempt to contain the rise of China?
I think you could say that China certainly does not welcome these kind of Quad initiative and other alliances, building measures from the United States and from other countries, because China, throughout the recent history, it has experienced such kind of coalitions against China, for example, during the Qing dynasty, and of course, more recently, the Quad and the 8-nation alliances of the Inter-Parliamentary Alliance on China, etc. So I think a few days ago, China's Foreign Minister Wang Yi said this the Quad looks like this kind of Indo-Pacific NATO with the aim to contain China and to undermine China's security. So certainly, this is China's position. It does not want to see the countries around its neighborhood to band up against China. And I think Wang Yi may have some point, because I think almost exactly 1 year ago, Mike Pompeo said as much. He said the Quad would help ensure that China returns only its proper place in the region. So that's another way of saying, yeah, we are trying to contain China within its own place.
Bonnie, this of course comes as we've seen a rise in the number of incursions we've seen from Chinese warplanes in Taiwanese contested airspace, which kind of brings me to my next question. Do you think it's likely that we need to worry about the prospect of military clashes in this region between the US and Beijing?
Well, I think that the consequences of certainly an incident, an accident, could be quite serious. So even if the risk is low, even if it's as low as maybe 15, 20%, that's still very significant because we're talking about two nuclear powers that if they went to war, it could be very difficult to control escalation. And we all know that in 2001, we remember that there was a collision when a Chinese fighter jet flew into a U.S. reconnaissance aircraft. And that Chinese pilot lost his life. And that is the closest we have come, I think, to a major crisis in the relationship, although the 1999 bombing of the Chinese embassy was yet another example of a crisis. So my view is that more steps need to be taken between the United States and China to build crisis communication and to have potential confidence building measures. But I'm quite pessimistic that we will do so. We've already negotiated two separate agreements to avoid accidents in the air and at sea. One just applies the multilateral agreement for what we call the Code of Unplanned Encounters at Sea. It's just a set of protocols when ships encounter each other that they're supposed to follow specific steps about making themselves known if they're going to put a helicopter in the air or do a search and rescue exercise. It's really quite simple. I'm told it's about 7 pages. But the Chinese are, for the most part, not even really adhering to this. They don't communicate when they encounter U.S. ships necessarily in the South China Sea. And in the Taiwan Strait, that's where the biggest danger is, because that is really, from my perspective, the only thing the U.S. and China could actually go to war about or over. And this, to me, is not a top priority for Xi Jinping at the moment. He doesn't need to reunify Taiwan with China in the near term because he has successfully deterred Taiwan independence. But as you say, the Chinese have been flying very close to Taiwan across the center line, circumnavigating the island. We could see them even fly aircraft over Taiwan or fire missiles, which would be, I think, very dangerous. But this is in part not because they are so alarmed about Tsai Ing-wen and her policies in Taiwan, but really because they are quite alarmed about the policies of President Trump toward Taiwan and the strengthening of the U.S.-Taiwan relationship. So it is a dangerous situation. And we have, in one occasion, seen in the South China Sea a Chinese destroyer that interfered with a freedom of navigation operation. It positioned itself in front of the path of a U.S. destroyer. And had that destroyer not veered away, there would have been a collision. And something like that could happen again. So yes, there's a risk of an accident, but I don't think either the U.S. or China want to go to war. They see definitely that it benefits them to avoid a military confrontation. But there could be a crisis. I don't rule that out.
From a potential of a military crisis to the very real economic crisis, Bonnie, we've talked at length today about the impact of decoupling, on an increasingly isolated China. I want to get your views on what an increasingly isolated US would be. We've got an audience question asking, how can the US prepare itself for the day when it is no longer number one? So I'm wondering, given we know the economy, the labor market, it's really weighed down by the impact of COVID-19, not to mention the impact of the healthcare crisis. Do you see a situation where we continue to see American exceptionalism if there's a political change?
Well, I'm not of the view that the United States is in an inexorable decline. And I think that there are many things that, so many strengths that the United States has, and the problems are in large part policies that are being pursued that are incorrect. So I think that with more effective leadership, that the United States can remain a very strong leader in the world. That said, the gap between U.S. power and China's power, it will certainly narrow in many indices. It already has. The period in which the United States has been this sort of sole superpower, that with the gap so great between the United States and other countries, has probably come to an end. And so the United States needs to figure out how to work with other like-minded countries to strengthen the rules-based international order. There are many components of the order, parts of the institutions in the system that need to be upgraded. The World Trade Organization certainly stands out as having been created at a time where nobody anticipated that a huge mercantilist country that has state capitalism was going to be so dominant in economic interactions in the world. So we really do need to update the World Trade Organization and many other parts of the post-World War II liberal international order. And so I think that should be the priority in the coming few years, that the U.S. must work with other countries in order to strengthen the international order.
Richard, in terms of the new, I guess, infrastructure that's required to deal with the new reality of what China is, do you think the proposed foreign relations bill is a necessary instrument? Do you think it's an overreach? Do you think it will just further damage that relationship?
Well, I think the answer to that question is going to depend on two things, which I'll come to just in a minute. But just quickly, I think the objective of the Act is not unreasonable, which is to try and ensure consistency in Australian foreign policy at a very difficult moment in our external relations, and to ensure that states and institutions do in Australia don't cut across Australian national interests. But I think there are two caveats to the answer to that question. One is, what will be the final shape of the bill? So it's being considered by a Senate committee at the moment. It could change finally passed. And the second caveat is how it will be implemented. I think it is true that the bill as currently drafted is very broad in its scope. It captures not just state governments, of course, but state government departments and a range of institutions, including notably universities. And its definition of a foreign arrangement is also very broad, so it really captures anything in any sphere, whether or not such an arrangement is legally binding. The Draft Act tries to, with this breadth of scope, by between what it calls core foreign arrangements, which is essentially between a state government or a department and a foreign entity, and other types of foreign arrangements. But even so, we're talking about, I'm sure, thousands of arrangements. And that potentially could be an enormous administrative burden for state governments, for their departments, for universities, for other organisations, for the poor old Minister for Foreign Affairs, who's the decision-making process, and for the Foreign Affairs and Trade. It's not entirely reassuring, I think, that the Department of Foreign Affairs has just been given $25 million to help prepare the way for this legislation. I think, if it's not to become just this enormous administrative messy burden, it's going to have to be in a way that really manages risk, so that the bulk of the attention and effort is on the most problematic kinds of arrangements between non-government entities and other foreign bodies.
Just got a couple of minutes. I'll end with you, Chengxin. We know that Beijing makes policy on a very long-term basis. They've been putting out these rolling 5-year plans since the 1950s. What is Beijing's long-term ambition? What do they want?
That's a very hard question. I wish I knew. But overall, yeah, you're right. I think because of the continuity of the Chinese government, the leadership, so it is more capable of doing some more forward planning, longer-term decision making about China's future. So you're right. Yeah, China has been having this 5-year plan for the past, except a few years of interruption for the entire history of the PRC. So I think its long-term plan is still mainly revolving around China's own domestic dynamics. I think a lot of China's foreign policy can be seen as the extension of its domestic priorities, such as national unity, territorial integrity, economic development, and also, of course, the legitimacy of the Chinese regime. So I think those key goals will be the key drivers of China's longer-term strategy and foreign and domestic policies, whether it's in terms of the BRI or China's the so-called China's dream, of the rejuvenation of the Chinese nation, etc. So China has laid out these 2 centenary goals by next year, and that's the 100 year of the founding of the CCP, and by the 2049, that's the founding of the 100 years of the PRC. So I think this really shows that we need to understand some of this kind of longer term dynamics that's happening in China, apart from this day-to-day events or crises and temporary policies or responses of coming out of China, to grasp what is really driving China's goals towards those priorities.
Well, as we were mentioning just before this panel started, we could probably talk about this all the way through to November 3rd, and in fact, we probably will be having these conversations, but this being the first panel, I want to keep things on time. Before we go, I just want to bring up the results of our audience polling question as to how Australia should be making its way in light of an ever increasingly dominant China in this part of the region. And we are seeing now a little bit of a flip, actually, from what we previously saw. 40% saying that we should push back and assert our position, and 60% saying that Beijing should accept the rising, I should say Canberra should accept the rising power of China and try to work with it. So it'll be really interesting to see how that develops throughout the course of the day. With that, I'd like to give heartfelt thanks to our panelists today from Washington, D.C. We really appreciate you staying up with us. Bonnie Glaser, Senior Advisor for Asia, Centre for Strategic and International Studies. From Canberra, Richard Maude, of course, our Executive Director of Policy at Asia Society Australia, Senior Fellow at the Asia Society Policy Institute, and from Melbourne, Deakin University's Chengxin, Associate Professor of International Relations. We really appreciate your time and sharing your views with us. In terms of everyone who's watching, please do join me in thanking our speakers. And just a reminder, of course, this is just the start of a number of great program sessions today. We'll be streaming all of that live all day. I encourage you to join our next session, of course, the global economy, with some more esteemed Bloomberg colleagues. That begins in about 20 minutes time. In the meantime, you can also explore the animations of the Asia Society artist in residence, Rocco Fazzaro, who is so vividly capturing all of the themes of our discussions today. Thank you so much for joining us.